UCC Jean Monnet lecture this academic year, so I'm delighted that we have two really great speakers addressing an exceptionally important theme to round out all of our activities and discussions this year. And today the focus is on the impact of disinformation and dark money and dirty politics on both national and EU politics and political systems. And our first speaker, Peter Geoghegan, will be addressing the impact of these, I suppose, increasingly nefarious forces on the UK's Brexit referendum campaign and also on the UK's exit process from the European Union. And Neale Richmond TD will develop that conversation and talk about the challenges of limiting and containing the influence of disinformation groups. And he'll speak in particular about his efforts to confront the attempts of the pro-Brexit campaign group leave.eu to migrate the registered office for its website to Ireland some time ago in order to retain its .eu internet address. So let me introduce our speakers. Well, Peter Geoghegan is an Irish writer and a broadcaster and investigations editor at the award-winning news website Open Democracy. And Peter has led some really important open democracy investigations into dark money in British politics and was nominated for a 2019 British Journalism Award and also for the Paul Foot Award. And his journalism has appeared in publications around the world, like including the New York Times and the Guardian, London Review of Books, and many, many more. And his last book, Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics, and a copy of which I have here, was published last August. And this book was a Sunday Times bestseller. From my own personal perspective, it was really one of the standout books of 2020 for me. A really revealing, critical and insightful examination of the influence of dark money in British politics in particular. And I noted on the front of the book, there's a commendation from Fintan O'Toole, which is really interesting because Fintan O'Toole is a former contributor to the UCC Jean Monnet lecture series. Neale Richmond is the Fine Gael TD for Dublin Rathdown and party spokesperson on European affairs. He has previously served as a county councillor. He was leader of the Irish delegation in the Committee of the Regions, and he was a senator where he chaired the Brexit Committee, a really important component of how Ireland engaged with the Brexit issue in recent years. He's a graduate of UCD and has a professional background as a parliamentary assistant and project manager. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Neale from all of his media contributions, not just here in Ireland, but across the UK and beyond, talking about Brexit and all things European. So I'm delighted to welcome both speakers today and really grateful for their time and their generosity in joining us. We'll be facilitating a Q&A today using the chat function, so please feel free to pop your questions or comments into the chat function during or after the lecture. I would ask you to note that the event today is being recorded, and if you're having any problems on the technical side of things, my colleague Jean O'Callaghan will be able to assist you. So again, please use the chat function if you need to. You're best advised to watch today's event using speaker format. You can just click on the view button the top right-hand corner of your screen to do that. So now that the housekeeping is out of the way, I am delighted to pass the floor to Peter Geoghegan. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Marion. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction and for the flash of my book. It's always appreciated in these difficult times. So thanks a million. Thanks for having me. I feel really honoured to be able to participate and coming on the back of so many fantastic speakers, including Fintan, of course, on this series. I feel deeply, deeply privileged. So thanks very much for having that, for inviting me along. And so today I'm just going to do a little bit of a kind of a run through of some of these issues around what we call dark money in politics, and particularly around British politics at the moment. And to be honest, I'm surprised sometimes when I see that book, because I wouldn't have thought that I would end up writing a book about dark money and disinformation in British politics. And I mean, maybe it's worth kind of giving a little bit of context where that book came from. And the genesis of that book was actually way back on the 21st of June, I remember distinctly, 21st of June 2016. 2 days before the Brexit referendum. And at the time, I was doing some freelance work for the Irish Times, and Mark Hennessy at the news desk at the Irish Times, based out of Scotland here, where I live in Glasgow, said, "Will you go down to Sunderland and write a piece about what's going on in Sunderland before the Brexit vote? Just, we'll even see, I don't think he said Sunderland, just somewhere in the north of England, get a feel for it." So I decided to go to Sunderland. I spent a couple of days in Sunderland talking to people about Brexit, seeing how they're feeling about the European Union. We all know where that went, and they weren't very happy about it, and they voted en masse to leave. But just as I was departing Sunderland myself, I was at a suburban metro station, a train station, just getting the train back to Newcastle, and I picked up a copy of the free newspaper, the Metro. It had a big advert in the front of it. It said, "Take Back Control," which was the Vote Leave campaign slogan. And there was a wraparound ad, and I noticed on the back there was the logo of the DUP, of the Democratic Unionist Party, and a little message that said "paid for on behalf of the Democratic Unionist Party," with the address in, I think it's Dundalk Avenue in Belfast. And I thought, that's very curious. I wonder what the DUP are doing, buying ads in British newspapers. That's very odd. And then I kind of did the thing that journalists do in a hurry too. You know, I was kind of had to file for the next day's paper. The train came along. I just took a snap and tweeted it out, and then just got on the train and kind of filed my copy for the next day's paper. But I found myself in the kind of days and months after that, and weeks and months after that, kind of coming back to that. You know, Sunderland became this big place for the Leave vote. I kept on going, what was going on with that DUP advert in Sunderland? What were they doing? And so myself and a colleague at Open Democracy, Adam Ramsey, started looking into this. And we ended up writing, we found that the DUP had not just been buying adverts in Sunderland, this Metro advert had been all across Great Britain, not incidentally in Northern Ireland, because the Metro doesn't circulate in Northern Ireland. The Leave campaign had also had paid for loads of placards that were paid for the DUP, which appeared all across Britain. There was Facebook ads and all the rest of it. And we ended up publishing a story about this. And we were able to see that the DUP had spent, at the start, we were able to say that it spent at least £250,000 this Brexit campaign. The true figure is actually much closer to £500,000. But what was really interesting about this, and the thing that kind of piqued my interest, was I'd worked as a reporter in Belfast, and I knew that political donations in Northern Ireland were kept secret under an old law dating back to the Troubles, really, where you weren't going to put out the names and details of political donors. So I started wondering, I wonder what's happened here. Has money gone through the DUP to pay for this big Brexit spending? Because if it went to the DUP, we wouldn't have to know anything about it. So we started publishing more stories about it, and lo and behold, it turned out that the DUP had received £435,000 from a group called the Constitutional Research Council. And a Constitutional Research Council sounds very grand. It sounds like the kind of, it sounds like maybe a research institution, a great august institution like UCC. Here's the Constitutional Research Council full of, scholars beavering away on the kind of constitutional tumult in the United Kingdom. There's plenty to write about. That's not what the Constitutional Research Council is. It's what's called in British law, British electoral law, an unincorporated association, which is another grand name for kind of a group that doesn't even have a legal standing. Unincorporated associations can give money to political campaigns, but they don't have to file accounts, they don't have to say who their members are, and crucially, they don't really have to say where their money comes from. And we were able to discover that the Constitutional Research Council had basically funneled £435,000 through the Democratic Unionist Party. And the Constitutional Research Council, the only person attached to it, its chair, was a man called Richard Cook, who was a failed Conservative candidate, multiple Conservative candidate, who lives on the outskirts of Glasgow. And so we published this story, I published a series of stories around it, and kind of started wondering, actually, started getting me asking questions about, well, who does fund our politics? How does money work in British politics? And from this one story, I started asking a lot more questions. And the phrase dark money, it's kind of an American neologism. It means any money that enters the political system that we don't know about. So for example, even though I've written an entire book about all this stuff, I still don't know where the money for the DUP's Brexit referendum spending came from. And actually, even though they've changed the law subsequently in Northern Ireland finally, so donations are no longer secret, if you retrospectively talk about a previous donation, you can end up with up to 6 months in prison, which is incredible considering that the maximum fine for breaking electoral law in the United Kingdom is £20,000. So I still don't know that. So as I often say in these talks, if anybody does know where the money came from, please get in touch. But that's a great example of what we call dark money. But it's most commonly associated with the United States. And Jane Meyer, who's a fantastic journalist in New York, and she wrote a great book called Dark Money. And it's really all about the Koch brothers. David and Charles Koch, these American industrialists, kind of mainly in oil, from the 60s on, spent huge amounts of money on American politics and really pushing American politics to the libertarian right. If you want to know, people, I think in Britain and Ireland often ask, why is America's climate change? Why is there so much skepticism around it? Well, the Koch brothers are one of the reasons why. They paid for research institutes, for academics, gave money to politics, all to push things like kind of very low tax ideas, but also climate change skepticism and all sorts of things like that. And that's what was known as dark money, because often it was very, very hard to see it. And I started looking, well, I wonder what happens in Britain. You know, do similar things happen in Britain? And one of the things I thought was most interesting when I started looking at British politics was I had kind of assumed that actually it's not like America. You know, in America, you're talking huge sums of money. It's hundreds of thousands, well, more. Like you're talking about billions, actually. The last American election was billions of dollars were spent in the election. In Britain, there's far less money spent on politics. The last general election would be a couple of £100 million. But what I realized then was actually it means that because British politics, like American politics, runs on private donations, there's actually way more space for access. There's way more room to buy access. And we're seeing that in Britain right now with this Greensill lobbying scandal around David Cameron. You know, the way in which senior political figures in Britain, you can kind of buy access. For example, as well, the Conservative Party, which is in Britain is mainly kind of funded by private money, and Labour really relies on money from the unions. The Conservative Party in Britain, if you give £50,000 a year to the Conservative Party, you become a member of what's called the Conservative Leaders Group, the leaders group of top donors. That entitles you to go to one meeting every quarter, a kind of roundtable meeting with the Prime Minister and leading Conservative cabinet ministers, in which no notes are taken, no record is kept of who was there, and you get the chance to talk privately and candidly with senior politicians, which is incredible for just £50,000 a year. And what's interesting with that too is, since Brexit, the donor base of the Conservative Party has changed massively. So it's gone from what would have been captains of industry to kind of, you know, like still heavily weighted towards the City of London, but it's become increasingly kind of reliant on very pro-Brexit, vocally pro-Brexit people, hedge funds and things like that, disorganized capital. So it's really interesting. So the money that's kind of behind British politics has also changed, you know, as the kind of political climate has changed, Brexit has happened. So anyway, I started doing a lot of investigations into money in politics in Britain, and Brexit kind of framed the work I was doing. I still do a lot of this work, even though, you know, we're kind of post the Brexit, you know, the Brexit negotiation period. But it really framed a lot of the work I was doing, and my book does look in some depth at how these sorts of things influence what happened with the way the Brexit process worked out. And one of the interesting things, so I looked at was like, you know, I kind of followed the Vote Leave campaign, which is the official campaign, which was led by Dominic Cummings and Matthew Elliott. And I started looking at like, well, how they spent money. And what was interesting is in the Brexit referendum, because Britain's not really used to referendums, the legislation around it kind of came in quite quickly, and a lot of people weren't really aware of what was happening. And one of the things that happens, you know, like in Ireland, but in British politics, there's one of the few barriers, well, until the last general election, and one of the things that kind of encouraged some good behaviour was a sense at which, when it came to elections and came to electioneering and money in politics, was a sense that parties would have to face the electorate again. So there's a sense that if you behave badly now, you might have to be held for account for it in the future. With the Brexit referendum, it was very different because it was a one-off event. So there was a big competition on both sides to become what was called the designated campaign. The designated campaign could spend up to £7 million, and smaller campaigns could spend up to £700,000. Why does that matter? It matters because, you know, that was kind of whoever got the designated campaign was able to spend far more than everyone else, and would be kind of the driving campaign. And Neale will talk about Leave.eu and Aaron Banks. I'll mention him in a minute as well. But Leave.eu and Vote Leave, which was Aaron Banks and basically versus Dominic Cummings, fought a big battle to see who would be the designated campaign. And eventually the Electoral Commission decided it would be Dominic Cummings and Vote Leave. But what happened then was Vote Leave started to have a problem in the weeks leading up to the referendum. Basically, they'd spent all their money. They'd spent the £7 million they were allowed to spend, but they were still raising money. And I was able to show, and others like me, other journalists, that what happened was they set up lots of kind of ginger groups, basically front organisations, and were funneling money to those organisations to spend on their behalf. And one of them was a youth campaign called Believe, which was set up by a guy called Darren Grimes, who I'm sure some of you might have seen now. He's become a bit of an alt-right warrior, keyboard warrior, in kind of cultural warrior in Britain. Well, Darren really wasn't like that before. He was a Lib Dem youth from Durham. He was a member of the Lib Dems. But he set up this pro-Brexit campaign called Believe, and in about 3 or 4 months, I think it raised £21. But then in the last 2 weeks of the Brexit referendum, it spent almost £700,000. And what had happened was basically Vote Leave was basically giving Vote Leave money to spend, which under electoral law is what's called joint working and has to be declared. And actually what was interesting with this, not only was it not declared as joint working, but actually the money wasn't even really resting in Leave's account. It was being paid straight to a data analytics company in Canada who were buying adverts on Facebook, which where almost all this money went. And the long and short of it was that it did subsequently emerge that Vote Leave had broken the law. They'd broken electoral law by overspending quite significantly, by around £500,000, which is a lot of money. But the only sanction in Britain, the maximum fine, as I mentioned, for breaking electoral law is just £20,000. So whereas in America, someone like Michael Cohen gets 3 years in prison for paying off Stormy Daniels, in Britain, all you get is a 20 grand fine, and that happens to somebody you've never even heard of. In this case, it was to a man called Alan Halsall, who was the designated kind of legal owner of Vote Leave. Similarly, with the Leave.eu campaign during the referendum, we discovered that there was a long-running investigation. I did a lot of work into Aaron Banks, looking at where his finances came from, and there was a lot of questions about it. But after a series of long-running investigations, it emerged that Aaron Banks's money had been kind of funneled through bank accounts in the Isle of Man. And in British politics, you're only supposed to be able to donate to political parties if you're in the United Kingdom or in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. But in this instance, the National Crime Agency decided that because the money came through an account that Aaron Banks owned, that it was okay. But again, that raises the spectre of people using shell companies, which has happened before in Britain, using shell companies in the offshore nexus of the kind of British protectorates, the Channel Islands, some of the protectorates internationally, places like the Cayman Islands, a potential there to use shell companies to fund politics. And during the Constitutional Research Council I mentioned at the start with the DUP, they were fined just £6,000 in the end, which was around 1/100th of the total amount of money that they spent. And the Electoral Commission decided they wouldn't investigate the Constitutional Research Council because they'd already looked at Vote Leave, and they decided, seeing as we've already found Vote Leave broke the law, there's no point in looking at them too. But that was kind of a lot of work I did a few years ago. And then I started asking a bit more generally. I started being really interested in how does money influence, if you think about this I mentioned the Koch brothers, they were very interested less in funding politics and more in funding the idea space within which politics takes place. They realized, following actually some kind of Hayek's ideas around this. Friedrich Hayek, who was an Austrian economist and a professor at London School of Economics, he kind of famously said, you don't want to buy politicians. What you want to do is own the idea space within which where the politicians get their ideas from. And what happened in Britain was really interesting. I became very interested in the world of think tanks, which are like kind of corporately funded think tanks who don't declare their donors. And in the aftermath of Brexit, I noticed a lot of these think tanks, like the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, started becoming really prominent. They were being quoted in newspapers all the time. They were people like the European Research Group of backbench MPs were citing these people in Parliament. They were being seen as like, there is a solution to this Brexit problem. It's with these right-wing think tanks. They've got these ideas. And many of the ideas, if you talk to experts in this, and lots of people, some of the names I can see on this call were very able to kind of rubbish these ideas quite quickly, but they gained a lot of traction, a lot of influence. And I started looking at how the influence these think tanks had in British politics. It was incredible, I found, how much access they had to British politicians. They were able to go and meet politicians, talk to them, at times off the record, and able to kind of push an agenda. And I think the argument I make in my book, in particular around the European Research Group, the European Research Group was funded by taxpayers. All the members, these conservative backbench MPs who were members of the European Research Group, they all kind of paid for it out of their expenses. It also raised some private money. And with only a skeleton staff, it was really effective in pushing a very hardline Brexit agenda. I'm sure some of you can remember about 2 years ago when the European Research Group almost felt like its own political party. They would have representatives being interviewed on the news. You would have, the spokesman for the European Research Group on Channel 4 News or on Newsnight. And they really did a really important job of pushing Theresa May at the time to the point where they were instrumental in getting rid of her. And the think tank world, this anonymously funded think tank world, and we know where some of these think tanks get their money. We know they've got money from the tobacco industry, the gambling industry, BP, the oil industry, people like this, but they don't have to declare their donors even though they're a charity. And what's also interesting is it doesn't take a huge amount of money. The average turnover for the Institute of Economic Affairs is about £2 million, which compared to America, where someone like the Heritage Foundation takes in hundreds of millions of dollars, it's small fry, but it can have a huge, huge impact. And I just wanted kind of, the last point I wanted to bring on was some of the things that the kind of disinformation point, which is partly what frames this as well, the rise of online disinformation. And we started to see that, I think, during the Brexit referendum. You know, I covered the Scottish independence referendum a couple of years. Previously, my last book was on that. And while there had been some online campaigning, it was still quite nascent. And I think it was still like kind of trying to find its feet. But 2016, the Brexit referendum, you know, all the kind of famous slogans, the millions of pounds for the NHS, the various pledges, a lot of that kind of circulated online. And what was really interesting as well during the Brexit referendum was Vote Leave, Dominic Cummings' campaign, spent the vast chunk of its money online and bought ads that were far more aggressive than the kind of conversations that they were having in public. So whereas in public it was very much about a kind of global Britain narrative, a narrative around opening out to the world, the online ads that Vote Leave pushed were all about Syria and Turkey and things like that joined the European Union, even those, and access to European Union space, migration, things like that, much more hard-nosed. And a lot of journalists weren't really looking out for this, and partly because we couldn't see it. Facebook only started an ad library a couple of years ago. And a lot of these conversations, I kind of picked it up when I was traveling around Britain and traveling around England in particular in the days leading up to the referendum. People would talk to you about adverts they'd seen on Facebook. I was kind of going, what's going on? And it took years actually for us to see those adverts. Finally, they came out through a parliamentary committee. And this is the kind of online Wild West of kind of digital disinformation. You know, I'm sure everyone's heard about Cambridge Analytica and this, were they kind of geniuses or were they selling kind of snake oil, this idea that you could manipulate voters? But the reality is Cambridge Analytica are just one of hundreds and hundreds of companies that do things like this. Very easy to buy these kind of tools. And we've seen, what I've become really interested in is the rise of third-party advertising. I don't know if we've seen that much in Ireland, but we've seen a lot in Britain. So these new groups appear out of thin air, basically. They say like they're a grassroots group and they start buying adverts. And interestingly, what they do is they rarely buy an advert that says vote for one party, you know, vote Conservative. They're much more likely to buy adverts that target other parties, so negative advertising against other parties, and targeting around specific issues. So we saw that in the 2019 general election in Britain. You know, I tracked a lot of these groups emerging, almost all pro-conservative, with names like Capitalist Worker, the Campaign Against Corbynism, you know, Fair Tax Campaign, all this sort of stuff. And they were being run by people who had a history of buying adverts, because this has started to happen after the Brexit referendum. You know, millions of pounds were spent on anonymous adverts that were pushing a kind of hard Brexit. That started then, as we've seen it since in more generally in British politics. And what's really interesting about this is politicians or political scientists have done studies about this, is that if you get a message that comes, say, in a Labour red or in a Conservative blue, you internalize, you've got your own biases around how you'll internalize that. But if you get this exact same message that comes from a seemingly independent third-party campaign, you view that message much more positively and are less likely to view it in terms of biases. So it's a really effective way to shift political conversations. And I think in some ways there's a focus when it comes to online advertising in terms of, does it make people vote one way or another? Like, were people fooled by Trump or Cambridge Analytica cause Brexit or Trump? I almost think that's the wrong question. What to me it's about is how these can feed into an online ecosystem, which can shift narrative, especially when, as has happened in Britain, the governing party no longer really adheres to norms. So in the run-up to the 2019 general election, we saw the Conservatives rebrand their Twitter account as a fact-checking account, and I kind of refuse to apologise and double down on it. They bought Google adverts to like a fake Labour manifesto. So we're seeing this kind of almost online bad behaviour, and it's continuing actually. We've got an election coming up very soon here for Holyrood for the Scottish Parliament, and a lot of the same people who bought from the Conservative right, who bought adverts in 2019 in the general election anonymously or in the names of these kind of fake grassroots campaigns, have now been buying adverts ahead of the Holyrood election as well. So this is clearly a kind of pattern that's going to continue in British politics. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Peter. That was sort of fascinating and alarming at the same time, if I could put it that way. But I really would congratulate you on your extraordinary investigative work in this particular field, because it's revealing all sorts of trends and truths to us, which I think there's a duty on us as political scientists, as academics, even as citizens, to take note of. And lots of lessons for Ireland here as well. I know you're focused in particular on Britain, but for Ireland, where we do have referendums, and where these kinds of influences are beginning to penetrate and filter through a little. There's an awful lot for us to reflect on. So thanks very much indeed for really such an engaging and illuminating overview of this area. I'm going to pass the floor now to Neale Richmond, TD. Neale, I was going to say follow that, but you have a very interesting story to tell as well about your work with the Leave.eu campaign. So over to you, Neale.
I'd like to stress from the start, I did no work with the Leave.eu campaign, lest anyone be a bit confused. But I would like to thank Peter, not only for that healthy dose of post-traumatic stress disorder, bringing me back to memories of sitting late at night, staring down a barrel, trying to debate someone from the ERG in a very small BBC studio that's actually an RTE. But hopefully I'll be able to follow on from his really engaging. I could have sat and listened to another 2 hours of that, and I'm really upset I forgot my copy of Peter's book. But for those of you who don't have a copy, go out, buy one, order one online. It is a scary but fascinating read, and it's something, most importantly, for those of us who are living in the Irish jurisdiction, we must be aware of and learn lessons from. But I suppose, as Peter's referred to the activities of Leave.eu throughout the Brexit campaign, prior to the Brexit campaign, but crucially, their role after Brexit during the negotiations of being that continuous pressure group, the sort of less respectable public voice of the ERG, and their particular emphasis on online campaigning. They're known as the bad boys of Brexit, and they really reveled in that moniker and how it impacts Ireland. So as I've said for the last few years before Brexit finally technically got done, Leave.eu very much maintained their presence in British politics and really pushed for the hardest of Brexits right up until Christmas Eve, when the negotiations concluded. They were saying that the UK needed to walk away, that no deal is better than any other deal. Let's go WTO, no deal, no problem, everything else. And then obviously Brexit happened. It actually did happen. The transition period ended, and whilst we had a deal in the terms of the TCA, it still left Leave.eu in the ether. And the whole premise is their name is Leave.eu. Their domain name for their online presence was also Leave.eu. And the vast majority of their campaigning work, if not all, their entirety of their campaigning work is done online. And we have to ask, well, why was Leave.eu such a valuable commodity? So valuable that they made the decision to relocate their head of operations nominally to Waterford. Now, there's a reason why they chose Waterford that I'll get into, but I don't want to get too explicit, because despite sitting in Leinster House, I don't know if I have parliamentary privilege, so I better go easy on what I say. But they relocated to Waterford and continued to operate as Leave.eu, even though the organisation Leave.eu still maintained all its activities in Bristol. Why Bristol? Because that's where Aaron Banks's insurance company was head officed as well. So I raised this in a number of ways and for a number of reasons. The reasons were quite clear. Why were Leave.eu operating now in Waterford? You know, Brexit is done. Isn't this what they wanted? They got what they wanted. They're out. They should be free to enjoy the sunlit uplands and should have no reason to remain a presence in the European Union. But more worryingly, the activities that they were seeking to continue post-Brexit. So you can see that there was a lot more to what this group does than Brexit itself. And we've seen a lot of their campaigns in relation to anti-immigration, anti-asylum seekers, tackling the woke culture, demanding that the BBC be defunded, and offshoots of Leave.eu have been to the forefront of a lot of the COVID-19 conspiracy theory denial sort of strand of thought. And there was very clear connections between the people that Leave.eu worked with the events that saw the Capitol building stormed in Washington, DC in January. And why did they want to move to Waterford? Now, technically, they said initially it was because they wanted to bring the campaign to across the European Union. They wanted Ireland to leave the EU next. And I have no doubt that the people who run Leave.eu, like many of the arch Brexiteers, simply want the European Union to collapse. It wasn't simply enough just to get the UK to leave. But crucially and quite cynically, the reason they wanted to retain that domain name was because that's what generates all their traffic. Their brand is leave.eu. And when you put leave.eu into search engines or just leave the EU, you'll often get directed to the web page, the home web page of leave.eu. That generates huge traffic, tens of thousands of people every week. And then their social media pages, particularly Facebook and Twitter, were alive. And the branding is and always was leave.eu. But in order to have a .eu domain name, you actually have to be active within the European Union. And I suppose I won't say this is where I came in, and I'm not claiming any responsibility for leave.eu's operations in Waterford being shut down, but I wrote a series of letters, made a series of engagements. And the first was to Comreg here, which was simply, you start, when you're doing a political campaign, it's always important to start with your domestic kind of oversight, and then moved on to the Minister for Communications. But ultimately, where this was all responsible for was with URID. So URID are a Belgian-based entity that has full authority over the .eu domain name on behalf of the European Commission. And there is very clear criteria about how you can qualify for a .eu domain name, just the same as if you're looking for a .ie or .co.uk or .fr domain name. You need to actually be operating in this jurisdiction. You need to have, or be a citizen there, and all these other things. And, you know, leave.eu had thought that, well, we got an address in Waterford, and there may be various reasons, but on foot of my letters, URID very kindly commenced an investigation and started making a number of inquiries. And a lot of this followed on from the work that Peter did, but also Carol Cowalder from The Observer and various other people in The Guardian who've been working on leave.eu and the various court cases and things like that that have come through the UK. And it became quite clear, well, the first response they received, that the person who leave.eu was registered to and their address in Waterford knew nothing about it. Now, whether or not that person knew nothing about it, who are we to say? But they very clearly said they didn't. And this was an alarm bell for URID. And they continued to press the investigation to the extent that they decided to suspend leave.eu's domain name until they could complete the investigation. Now, their domain name has disappeared ever since, and it's now I think that it's leaveu.co.uk or something else, or leave.eu matters.co.uk. And this has had a massive effect on their draw and their traffic. I did a couple other things at the same time, because if leave.eu were actually going to operate in Ireland and they were to be a legitimate holding, well, then a lot of things kick in that are simply different than in the UK. And this is something that has come up in Irish politics, particularly the way Sinn Féin operate in relation to donations in the two different jurisdictions in the island. So I wrote to the Standards and Public Office to make sure, well, if this is a political campaign group, are they providing declarations to show that they adhere to donation limits and declaration limits that are very, very clear in Irish law? And Peter was talking about the sort of money that's generated in American politics by the Koch brothers and in turn on British politics. And as a politician who does engage in fundraising, I'm very aware that you can say that there's very little money, I suppose, in some way in the UK, particularly compared to the US. But then on an Irish level, you know, an €80 super draw ticket is really the extent of our fundraising capability. It's different league, but perhaps that isn't necessarily a bad thing. And definitely continental colleagues in the Nordic countries, they rely wholly on state funding in order to continue their activity. As part of my sort of probing and pushing and just generally trying to make life uncomfortable for leave.eu, I also obviously contacted the revenue commissioners, because if they're operating here, were they revenue compliant? And contacting both SIPO and revenue were kind of secondary and not as relevant, because ultimately URID did suspend the web domain and leave.eu has not contested that. They threatened to contest it. They threatened to move wholesale to Ireland to be the front and the funding of the IREXIT campaign, but they never actually did, or they haven't yet. And I suppose a lot of it would reflect on their other activity that Peter didn't mention politically, was Aaron Banks and Gary Whitmore getting involved with Winston Peters' New Zealand First party that lost all their seats in the recent New Zealand election, despite the assistance of leave.eu. But looking at SIPO and revenue, has to shine a light on a lot of the dark money that Peter refers to throughout his book and he did through his speech. We still don't really know exactly how leave.eu got all their funding, and there's so much mystery and intrigue. But more worryingly, nefarious actors at play, that would be an extremely worrying thing if a body like that was able to base and operate itself in the European Union. And I suppose to conclude my points, I am hopeful and I'm fairly sure that Leave.eu have given up on trying to brass-plate their way in Waterford to continue their operations, but it asks very serious questions about Ireland and the EU's approach to how we tackle political disinformation and the online campaigning world, because it is extremely difficult out there. It's extremely difficult to deal with social media platforms in terms of monitoring sources and comments that are made. I've made multiple complaints about remarks on social media about myself, but unless it's a personal threat, they're very rarely removed, even what they're saying, and it brings into whole question in relation to defamation law. And there's some really harrowing examples and cases, and it has been very noticeable in the last year about the wormhole people can go down when they're looking at social media. But you always have to worry, you always have to ask, well, who's behind this? You know, who's providing the money, who's providing the energy, who's providing the people to generate this? Because simply dismissing it as one or two people with strong opinions is not enough. And if we cherish our democracy and cherish the open nature, and democracy isn't perfect, it never has been, it's constantly challenged, but if those of us who believe in it, we have to always strive for the higher standards, even if sometimes they're not possible. And with that, Mary, I'm happy to conclude. Thank you so much again for having me.
Thanks very much indeed, Neale. And again, another fascinating story, and that level of detail that you provide is it's really useful, actually, and again, it's really illuminating. And I think there's an awful lot maybe to think about and to unpack from the Irish perspective as much as from the broader perspective, it has to be said. Can I just ask you, before we go to Q&A, just a couple of quick questions, Neale? What kind of pushback did you get from Leave.eu? I mean, was it intense?
Yeah, no, well, look, I've been dealing with Brexit trolls for the past 5 years, and they are vicious. It's very personal, and I get plenty of trolls from the other side of the dynamic on an Irish perspective, and plenty of sectarian abuse as well. And Leave.eu tried to, well, they called me a third-rate politician, which was great, and they decided to attack me, and they just didn't get Irish politics, and they used that sort of wide boy persona to try and talk down about me and talk bad about Ireland. To be honest, anyone with half a brain saw that and probably might have won me a couple of preference votes in due course next time and done that down. But you can definitely feel the very clear pylon that comes whenever you engage with an organization like this that has a database, artificial or real, of so many different accounts that can influence and direct traffic your way and pick up the most random unflattering pictures of you and use that to target you in so many ways. But no, never once had a single legal letter or anything beyond social media, to be honest.
And was it coming from Irish sources as much as British sources?
No, very much British sources, but there was a few Irish sources, and this is something that I think is quite worrying. And it gets conflated in this sort of realm of anti-establishment, anti-government rhetoric that we've seen quite clearly here in the last 12 months when it comes to the sort of anti-lockdown conspiracy theorist, the sort of smiley face brigade. I'm not going to mention individuals' names, but you kind of know who I'm talking about and the graffiti that's on Dunleary Pier about them. It fed into all that sort of collective of people. A lot of people who, as I said, the vast majority have been long, like I have over 7,000 Twitter accounts blocked and muted at this stage. Don't particularly like having to do it, but I have a quick rule: if you're abusive to me, you're insulting to me, and not just saying your idea is bad or calling you a blue shirt or something like that. It's usually a little bit more spicy than that. Well, then I block. To be honest, I don't have time for that. You
did seem to be one of the sort of the sole politicians who was pursuing this particular issue. So I'm curious as to what kind of an appetite there is across the political system for regulating or confronting these kinds of new phenomena.
I suppose I was probably the sole politician who talked about Leave.eu, and that was a direct hangover from the work I had done in relation to Brexit for the past 4 or 5 years. Other politicians who were involved in Brexit have moved on to be Minister for Justice and staying as Minister for Foreign Affairs. They're considered with other roles. But the whole area of disinformation and social media platforms, it is actually getting quite a bit of attention in the Oireachtas. We saw it 2 weeks ago in front of the Communications Committee. We saw it in front of the Local Government Committee. We have seen extremely difficult questions posed, particularly to the social media companies who provide platforms for this level of disinformation. We see it if a newspaper, be it whatever newspaper, runs an article that's insulting, abusive, and defamatory, well, then there's very clear consequences for them. But a social media company that provides a platform for such ideas, be they in a 280 character message or something wider, there doesn't seem to be any consequences. And this is something that the whole world collectively has to deal with. Now, you don't need to go down the route of other countries and going down the line of censoring people, but when it's being used and abused, which it quite clearly is.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Neale. I'm going to go to the Q&A, and some people have raised hands as well, but I might turn to my colleague Brian Turner from the Department of Economics. You might like to unmute yourself and unvideo yourself, Brian, to ask your question, and it's a question for Peter.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks both Peter and Neale for very interesting presentations, and as Mary said, enlightening and informative, and also slightly disturbing at the same time. Question for Peter: like, it strikes me that a lot of what you're talking about isn't widely known about yet. So I just wonder, do you think that the mainstream media has a role to play here, and is there an onus on the mainstream media to actually inform people about this, so that they can have a healthier dose of skepticism when they see these kind of things? And almost, obviously I'm not suggesting that they're scams, but if people are more informed about online scams, then they're more wary of them when they see the kind of the typical signs of them. So is there a role there for mainstream media to kind of inform people and I suppose increase their awareness of these things?
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind comments. Yeah, no, I think there is. I think that like the squeamishness around this, especially because it was kind of caught up, I think, particularly in Brexit, and a lot of, like, particularly the BBC, but other outlets were so worried about how they covered Brexit in the aftermath that and I think they kind of got themselves into so many knots over this stuff as well. And we're constantly trying to find ways to both sides of what did the Remain campaign do and all the rest. And I think that was a real problem. And I think it's one of the reasons why it took a very long time. And in the end, like, I don't think there was even, I don't think there was a panorama about any of this stuff, for example. And I think there has been, I think journalists have been quite slow. I've been really surprised. There was a story recently about a campaigner who bought adverts and like spent £50,000 during the general election, and she couldn't say where the money came from. And like the Mirror published it, and I saw like loads of journalists, and it was in Politico and stuff. It's in my book. I published that 3 years ago. Like, and I'm not saying like, oh my God, I've been scooped, but it's like, and I really didn't mind the credit, but it's almost like the surprise of this stuff surprised me, that other journalists were surprised by this. So I think there's been a real slowness. I think finally some of the pennies starting to drop. But I know when I started doing this work, I would speak to friends of mine, colleagues, journalists, who were like, why are you bothering doing this? Like, it's not really important. It doesn't really matter. One of the things I got a lot was like, oh, the Brexit referendum is over, so why do you care about how the money was spent? And you're like, well, that's not really, like, journalistically, that's not how these things work. And also, we're going to have more elections. It's not like we're not going to have more electoral processes. So I think it's, I do think it's been quite slow. Hopefully that will change. But I think a lot of journalists, but partly as well because it probably doesn't fit that neatly into what journalists do. Like, political reporters look very firmly at what's actually happening in a political context, what's happening inside legislatures, who's briefing against whom. And this is almost much more like kind of investigative and meta. And I think for a lot of reasons, it's been an area that's been missed a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Brian, for the questions. It's sort of a related question, which you've maybe half addressed from F. Burke in the chat there. Did the BBC shy away from addressing the hard questions to the Leave.eu cohort? Do you buy that?
Yeah, I do think so. Like, I thought, like, and they were very good at, like, so when Vote Leave were found to have broken the law, like, what happens was they were like, I think it's the bad actor thing. If you're a bad actor and you're willing to kind of abuse the system, you will get away with it. So, for example, how that happened was the Electoral Commission had an investigation. They'd found the Vote Leave broke the law, and there's a thing called Maxwellisation in Britain, which comes from the the late and much lamented Robert Maxwell. And basically it means that if a government, if a public body is going to write a report and it's going to mention you in a negative light, they kind of have to, as a norm or convention, they have to send it to you beforehand. And it kind of comes from Robert Maxwell. So what had happened was they'd sent this out to Vote Leave, and they knew it was coming. So Vote Leave organised an interview with a friendly BBC journalist on the BBC, in which they kind of said, this is all nonsense. And the report hadn't come out yet. So they were able to get ahead of the story and kind of kill it before it happens. And I think that's a real problem as well. Like, I think it was only with the last general election, I know from talking to colleagues in the BBC and elsewhere, the last general election and in the Boris Johnson administration now, where journalists now realise they are being lied to. I think until then there was a sense that if officials were telling you something that wasn't true, they weren't doing it intentionally. And I think Britain's kind of through the looking glass on that now. So belatedly, I think journalists are catching up and realising, actually, we can't trust things that come to us always from official sources. That isn't, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to come to my colleague, Piers McInerney, and then I'll come to my colleague, John O'Brennan. Piers, you might like to unmute yourself as well. Piers McInerney is from the Department of Geography here at UCC and has been doing some really Trojan and important work in terms of confronting the far right here in Ireland. So Piers, you're welcome to put your question to the panel.
Thank you very much, Mary. Can you hear me?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks to both speakers. And Peter has done quite extraordinary work in this area for some years now, and his contribution and that of Carol Cadwalder have been really extraordinarily important, I think. And Neale, and I don't share his politics, but he has really fought the good fight as well on the whole Brexit question. So it's great to have these speakers today. I suppose my question would be, and there's a bit of a dare in the margin, you know, we've seen the weaponization of social media with a particular end in view in the case of the Brexit campaign, and Peter has illustrated very well the mechanics of how that was done in the background. Now, my concern is with sort of the broader implications of all this. I mean, we're now seeing a constituency of people among the general public who choose actively, I think, not to believe the manifest evidence that is put before them by the mainstream media, by kind of, you know, fact checkers of various kinds, all of those kind of people. We've seen the same thing in Trump's America, and thank God he's gone. And the question arises, I mean, how does one fight this? And I know we can talk about tougher legislation, like we're seeing hate legislation on the way now, and we can talk about making social media people publishers and not platforms. I mean, we're all aware of those kind of arguments. I also wonder if there's a role for educators. I mean, should we be educating people in what you might call judicial discernment, really from primary school upwards, as they're doing in Finland, by the way? So my question really is the broad one, and what Peter has done is illustrated very clearly the particular application of these toxic influences, but that's what they are. These are a threat to democracy. So what do we do, and what measures across a range of possible areas do we need to take to fight this phenomenon?
Thanks, Piers. Neale, I might go to you first.
You're muted, Mary.
Sorry. Sorry. Neale, I might go to you first.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Piers, and thank you very much for your compliments. There's no simple solution to this. This is the great difficulty for everyone, academics, journalists, public representatives, and society at large. Ultimately, the norms that have gone before us have changed, but they've always changed. And I think we have to recognize that the days of mass rallies or canvassing outside churches went a long time ago for people in my profession, but equally the door-to-door campaigning is only part of it. And we were looking from a cynical, not cynical, but from a hard-nosed campaigning point of view about, well, where do people get their media? Where do people get their information? And we have to accept it that a lot less people read what you refer to as the mainstream media. How many people pride themselves saying, well, I don't have a television at home. And you know, and they don't watch the television news, they don't watch the chat shows, they don't watch the newspapers. And I certainly, or read newspapers as we know it, and I certainly, this is something I've noticed in the last year, the amount of time something will be forwarded on by my peers, my contemporaries, in the sort of five-a-side football WhatsApp group, not that we've played five-a-side football anytime recently, about, oh, have you seen this? Supposedly you're a member of the Orange Order, and you know you want the Queen to reinstate as the head of government. And I'm going like, well, that's charming. And you're trying to then work back, where does this image or GIF or forward on that had started in a WhatsApp group come back? And I use what it could be any platform, but generally it's WhatsApp. And I think, and there's a few questions kind of in the sidebar. We're talking about how do we address this and whose responsibility? Well, it's everyone's responsibility. But we have to be aware that there are always people who will look to seek to manipulate the opportunities ahead of them. And that may be for financial gain, business gain, political gain, or indeed just personal or societal gain. And you talk about the impact in America, and I think it was really quite stark about 4 or 5 years ago when we heard the alternative facts comment enter into lexicon for the first time. Well, alternative facts are very much alive and well. And one thing that I have noticed in that it's no longer good enough, the amount of people who will give an opinion, and it's an opinion, and then you'll disagree with them and they go like, well, we'll just have to agree to disagree, and that's my fact. And can you imagine if you're doing your PhD viva and you're presenting to your external examiner and they said, okay, now talk us through it, and go like, well, agree to disagree, we'll move on. I'm quite happy in my opinion and I'm happy in my world. And that can come from a nefarious element, but also, you know, a happy element going like, oh, well, everything's okay. I don't need to worry about the climate emergency. Sure, of course, I'm perfectly fine where I am. And this is the great difficulty. And it's always been the great difficulty. A lot of what Peter's talking about is not new to an extent. It's just a different way of doing it. And it's a modern way, a contemporary way. And yes, public policy experts and political representatives are behind the curve, but they're always behind the curve. And the whole point is not to give up on the system, but is constantly to work for a better system. And look, in America, we can see that the political tide has changed, but the polarization in the UK is still very live, and we're going to face very real challenges in this jurisdiction. And we can't dismiss concerns that people may have in terms of where we store voter data or how we fundraise for politics in this country.
Thanks, Neale. Peter?
Yeah, I think Neale covered a lot of really salient points there. I think, you know, and I think you're right about this idea that, like, you know, legislation and all the rest of it's part of the answer. I talk about in my book. There's definitely things we could do. I actually think some of the reforms in Ireland, the heads of the bill on the Electoral Commission in the Republic of Ireland look good. I think there's a lot to be said for that. But it's not a panacea. It's not going to be a magic bullet. I don't think you can legislate your way out of these things. And I think there is, you know, like, I'm sure, you know, I'm really struck, and actually, especially in Ireland, with people, you know, people I know or family of people I know who've gone down a lot of rabbit holes in the last year. You know, there's a real issue there. You know, the number of people who are just asking questions, you know, and we have to ask what's going on, like what's getting to the point where, you know, I've stopped engaging with people on social media around this because it's impossible to, but where, you know, I'm sure lots of people have this experience where, you know, what's difficult as well is I even find in my own work is what you're trying to instill in people is a healthy skepticism and knowing where to ask questions and knowing what the right questions to ask are. But when I see that happens to the other side of it, where it becomes, well, you don't know, you know, you can turn that in a really negative way, which I've seen a lot of that, and I think there's. I'm sure education is part of it. I think, you know, like, media has to be part of this. Quality media, I think, does have to be part of it. I'm quite worried actually at the moment to see so many good media going behind paywalls. I think that's a real problem. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult for people who don't, you know, there's a split there as well, and the people who can afford to consume high quality content and those who can't. And I'm worried that we're making it harder for people to not to consume quality content. And that is a worry I have. And I'm not just saying that as a kind of self-interested journalist. I think there is an issue with that too.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. I'm going to go to my colleague, John O'Brennan from Maynooth University. John, you might like to ask the question yourself, if he's there. John O'Brennan, Jean. No, maybe I'll come back to John. John O'Brennan, you should be able to talk now, John.
I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille. Let me say first, thank you, Mary, for hosting another really engaging event. I bought Peter's book when it came out last year. It is absolutely superb. The two books that really stood out for me last year actually are somewhat alike, Peter's book and Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People. And the thing that they have in common is that they follow the money in both instances. And I've come back to Peter's book in recent weeks because of the litany of scandals that have emerged in the UK. And that's what I want to just focus on, which is corruption, just for a moment. Having spent a lot of time in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, I've had to sort of triangulate myself in a way, because I think we go to Central and Eastern Europe and we almost always assume they are far more corrupt than we are. And yet in our own country, we've had two recent Taoiseach accused of very, very serious malfeasance. One who had many, many millions paid to him by businessmen in the 1980s, and another who couldn't account for very large sums of money in his bank account, various points not so long ago. But in the UK, and this is what I think is really interesting, there seems to be no traction at all for the publicity attached to corruption, and no penalty or sanction of any kind for those in public office now. But I like to remind people that the largest corruption scandal in history actually took place in Britain. People may remember the Al Yamama case from the 1980s, where BAE, British Aerospace Systems, sold a lot of gear to Saudi Arabia. This was the deal that Mrs. Thatcher's son was a middleman on and made a vast amount of money on. But we learned later, because of the journalism of The Guardian, that one Saudi prince had received £1 billion of British taxpayers' money over that 20 or 25-year period in bribes. And so that's the first point about corruption, that actually we really need to rethink in both Britain and Ireland this sense that somehow we don't do corruption, because I think there's lots of evidence to suggest we do. But the more important point, I think, is about how we reach a point, certainly in the UK case currently, Peter, with the prospect of another, 3.5 years or so of Conservative government. How on earth do you staunch the flow and stop this trend, which is taking Britain to a very seriously dark place, and where its international reputation is really in danger of being trashed? And I think this is potentially more important than some of the stuff we've been debating on Brexit. So I suppose I'm asking about good governance, the structures you can put in place to try and guard against corruption, and how we might better deal with all of that.
I would very much agree, actually. And if you get the most recent version of my book, the paperback, that's like the trade paperback is the one that you have, is the most recent one, came out in January with a new chapter at the end all about COVID-19 and corruption. Actually, it was just based on a long piece I wrote for London Review of Books last November. And another plug, I have a piece in next week, London Review of Books, about some of these issues as well. So I am trying to address them. But I very much agree, actually. And even I've been surprised by some of the levels of what we're seeing. I won't walk through the entire Greensill scandal and David Cameron lobbying, but I think there's been a real lack, there's been a real lack of willingness to name these issues in Britain for quite a long time. And I do agree. If you look back, Britain, the two things that have happened as a systematic analysis, what you've got is you have a history in which corruption took place. You have a series of scandals like the scandal from the 1980s, but also cash for access, cash for honours, cash for questions, the role of Mohammed Al-Fayed, Ian Greer, there's a host of names. But also at the same time, and I guess this has happened in Ireland too, the new public management agenda of the last 40 years has meant that a lot more of the state is outsourced. So the space and the role for lobbying and potential corruption has grown massively. Ireland's relationship to the state is quite different to Britain's. We didn't have the same post-1945 welfare state, but at one stage in the 60s and into the 70s, Britain had a very, very large state apparatus. And there's a lot of power of organised labour, and there was a lot of issues with that too. But what that meant was the space in which you were lobbying for government work was actually quite small. Now the space within which you're lobbying for work is massive. It's about a third of central budgets in Britain are outsourced. So it's not hard to do the maths on that. If you look at, say, the COVID contracting, we've just today, actually, Transparency International released a very good report on COVID contracting, and they found hundreds of millions of pounds not only went to politically connected firms, it went to firms that hadn't existed 60 days earlier. Like, people were setting up bespoke firms with no prior experience whatsoever and getting multi-100 million-pound government contracts. These are huge slabs of money. So that's going on at the same time. Like, I do a lot of work around freedom of information. I've been very, very active in this space, particularly in the last few years. We just had a report out before Christmas. We have a case, I'm involved with a case that's going to go before an information tribunal at the end of next week to do with the Cabinet Office around FOI. That transparency mechanism has just been choked to death, basically, by the British government. At the same time as routine transparency publications aren't happening, you know, and it's very, very difficult. The Labour Party has decided this is an issue they're going to go hard on, partly because of the history of John Major and the kind of history of sleaze from the 90s. And they are trying to force the issue. But like, I was surprised even today, I was listening, you know, there's these text messages between Boris Johnson and James Dyson, and that's now been filtered through the prism purely of, look, the pandemic was happening and the guy was trying to do the best for the country, which I think a lot of us could be sympathetic to if it wasn't happening within a context of this kind of access to government. And I think that's, you know, I saw Justin Welby today making a kind of similar statement, we should all kind of love each other and get over it. And you're like, what do you mean? Like, when we can see this manifest relationship between power and money running through the system, and I think in some ways, like, at least in Ireland, we had, maybe it was unusual. Like, growing up, there was some awareness that corruption was a facet of our politics, whereas in Britain, I think there has been a blight disregard for it. And I think a lot of the things that we would see as corrupt and cronyist and at least clientelistic about an access to power just haven't even been interpreted in those ways for a very long time. And so, no, I think it's, and the international side of this, I think, has been really missed in Britain. I think there's a kind of, like, because I think that Britain has definitely become a lot more insular over the last 5 years. So there isn't much of a thing about what does this do for our reputation? What does this look like internationally when we see these kind of litany of scandals? And the one thing as well is, like, resignations just don't happen in British politics. We had Patrick Mercer, Johnny Mercer resign yesterday over because the British government wouldn't stop the right to try soldiers for gross human rights abuses in Northern Ireland. That seems to be their only red line, basically, is if you can actually be done for genocide, that's the red line, that's the hill you're going to die on, which is a very perverse hill. Meanwhile, someone like Robert Jenrick, who sat down next to a Conservative donor, Richard Desmond, at a fundraiser, subsequently overturned a huge planning decision in his favour and admitted apparent bias in a legal case around this. He still has a place at the table. So it's quite clear that you are not going to be punished for this. And the problem, again, is also, once you look at the top of British politics, Boris Johnson, of course, you know, has so many, you know, has shown scant regard for these things for years. But and we can also see with David Cameron, and Tony Blair has basically sold himself to anybody who'll pay him too. So there's a long history with this, and I think there's been a real reluctance in Britain to see this as something that's not is not okay. And you know, I think it's a real. I think that in the long run has actually got even more potential for damage, because it really destroys people's trust in politics in a way that can actually be very advantageous to the ruling party. I don't think it's too far at times to look at what happens in Britain and what's happened in Hungary. I wouldn't go that far, but there's some elements. I thought the recent race report and the kind of conversations around that, similarly, this free speech in school and universities, in which the government published a white paper that only quoted, purely was anonymously funded think tank Policy Exchange, and a lot of the research on that was subsequently knocked down very easily. And I think that's the kind of stuff that doesn't happen in a serious liberal democracy.
Yeah, the flag issue as well, exactly the same. Thanks so much. It's great.
Thanks very much, Peter. I might just go to a question, which is probably for both of you in the chat, from John Hill, as an Irishman living in the UK, who's been aghast at the rapid descent of British politics into a hole of lies and misinformation, and really just posing the question about, is Ireland the next target for some of these forces, and what can be done to insulate us from this? Neale, is that something you're concerned about?
I thought you were about to say, is that something you're canvassing for? No, thanks. So, I might use, this question actually lends itself to a lot of the points John O'Brennan was mentioning as well. And I think we have a very stark history of politics in this country and what went on in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, and much of it in local authorities I sat in. And it was the the moving, it wasn't just elected representatives, but public officials. But I think we have to recognize in our defense that we have pretty strong tools at our disposal in terms of the Lobbying Act that was brought in terms of transparency. Others would know better in terms of access to freedom of information. It's like everything when you look at Ireland from the outside in as opposed to the inside, we have got it all that bad. There are still many concerns. But there was a couple of points I'd pick up on. And it's something, obviously, I've been very fortunate to spend a lot of time dealing with British politicians for the last 5 years. And genuinely, the vast majority of them are very pleasant people. But it is a completely alien system to me. Their electoral system, for a start, the fact that you can just get plonked into a safe seat depending on your political party in somewhere in the northwest or somewhere in the shires, and you'll sit in a 20,000 majority. You don't even need to live in the constituency, and you're completely isolated. Whereas sitting in my 3-seater, where we have 2 seats, okay, pandemic times, like if I wasn't out canvassing 72 hours this weekend, I'd be really worried about what's going forward. And that forces you, some people will talk about clientelism, but that forces you to be a lot more engaged and a lot more accessible to everyone, but also a lot more accountable, I would argue. And the growing diversity of our politics. So we've gone from the old 2.5 system where one party was essentially the party of permanent government to a far more fluid situation now, emerging parties. Ironic, I'd say that after the last general election, that it is actually a good thing that we have more parties and more people in our politics. And I just think that we are in some ways insulated by what is happening in the UK. But what is happening in the UK has been a very, very clear move to the extreme. And it happened with the Labour Party for the last couple of years as well, but it's happened with the Conservative Party now. When certain vested interests can get a hold of a party, because of the electoral system, they can get hold of the entire system. So if you think back to the referendum, the Brexit referendum, it was a narrow margin, yet we've ended up getting probably the hardest possible Brexit as a result. And you think about the Labour Party and under Corbyn, how they went for a very clear referendum and they were constantly beset by disruptions in their parliamentary party, but yet their parliamentarians, so many of them chose to retire simply because they knew that their constituency organisation had been taken over by momentum. But the exact same thing happened in the British Conservative Party, with UKIP coming in with the sort of the reverse entry approach. And we see it in the media as well. And I think the one thing I think we have to be cognizant of, and these are things that might sort of challenge, is, you know, in the UK, so many people have clearly become just desensitized to really big issues, you know, and they go like, oh, that's fine, you know, another thing, sure, that's just what government does. And like the issues that have come up over the last couple of weeks, they should be enough to topple a government in any mainstream regime, I would argue, but yet they barely get a mention. The fact that government ministers can boycott proper legitimate media programs for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months with no real outcry, I just can't fathom how that happens. But when you have a low electoral turnout and an essentially rigged electoral system, I can see how that develops. I would argue we don't have that sort of problem in this place. And one thing that I think we have to be aware of is that how this can often be created is that everything is the gotcha moment. Everything is an outrage. So it's the sort of reverse approach. Now people are totally desensitized and these things happen. But if you're constantly outraged, there's a headline in a certain Irish newspaper a month or two ago talking about the amount of money that was spent on water provision in the convention centre and how it equated to €400 a day of your taxpayers' money being wasted on drinking water. Now you do the maths on the amount of people that work in the convention centre, it's less than 75 cents a person to have access to a water fountain. But this was a front page splash. And I have to put the question, a lot of people don't like it, but are we just becoming to use everything's a disgrace, everything's a sackable offence, everything is stop the press? And I think that is equally as damaging, because what it has led to in the UK, where everything was express, and look, the expenses scandal was a disgrace, but then we're trying to transfer that over to here, and we have a very anglicised approach to our media. That when I was 7 years as a county councillor, the only time I appeared in the newspaper was when they talked about my attendance and my expenses, and talked about €90 on mobile phone charges. And I was like, yeah, €90 a year is kind of what you spend on a mobile phone when you're a part-time county councillor who spends your life on the phone, while you're also trying to hold down a job. You know, that sort of sensationalist, we've inherited a very bad system, and I'm wary that we don't we're not in that place, thankfully, in this jurisdiction. But if we become so desensitized and everything's a shock, then we could easily end up there. I do like to think that we have the structural and political levers to prevent that, though.
Thanks very much indeed. Neale, do you want to come in on that point, Peter?
No, I think there's some. I think there is, like, I think it kind of speaks in some ways to that wider point I was making as well about trying to figure out. I think, you know, both media and elsewhere, like, what are the big issues that are worthy of, you know, and actually it comes down to, like, at times as well, it's about trying to separate. I do think it's an important role journalistically to separate. Part of the job is to figure out what you think is valuable, what you think is important. You know, even with, say, with these COVID contracts, like, you know, sometimes some of the companies that have got COVID contracts are people who've done a lot of work for the government for a very long time, and their existence and their say relationship with the government in terms of funding money into politics probably doesn't mean that that's why they got these contracts. But you can ask a question about how politics is funded through that. And I think there is times where I think it's important, and sometimes, you know, I'm lucky in that I have a job that allows me to be able to have a latitude in terms of what I decide. I'm very conscious not all colleagues have that opportunity. Sometimes it can be easy to kind of get quite excited about stuff that isn't particularly exciting when you think about it, and then which can actually dilute the really important stories, the bits where you go, well, this is a really important thing, where some company this appears out of nowhere and happens to be run by somebody's friend and gets a huge big government contract, and that's they're the issues where you're going, well, what is going on here? And I think it almost gives an opportunity when we let those opportunities go by kind of conflation them with things that aren't, like the kind of James Dyson text allows it to go, oh, this is there's nothing to see here. But actually at the root of it, you have to go, well, what is going on here? Like, what's the structural issues here? And that's what I try and go back to.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Peter. And I think that's the value of the kind of investigative journalism that you and colleagues have been doing at Open Democracy and elsewhere as well. And it's a hugely important public service, it has to be said. Gratitude to you and colleagues for that. I'm conscious we're coming to the end of time, and I'm not going to get to questions from colleagues Liz O'Connor and Catherine Thackeray and Brian Turner and others. So my apologies for that, but the clock is against us, I'm afraid. So I'm going to bring things to a close this afternoon, and I want to start by saying a very sincere word of thank you to Peter and to Neale for two really fascinating contributions. And I'm glad in particular that we've got an opportunity to put on record, Neale, your role in confronting the Leave.eu campaign. I think it's important. And likewise, Peter, I'm glad that we can provide an opportunity for the story of dark money and dirty politics and disinformation to be publicised more widely. So thank you for your generosity and for being here today. It's really very much appreciated. I want to thank my colleague Jean O'Callaghan in the background today for her tech support. I must also thank the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet programme, which is financially facilitating all of the events that we've had so far this year. And I want to thank the audience as well for joining us over the last few months. It's been great to welcome colleagues, not just from Cork, which is our usual audience, but from much further afield. And it's really been gratifying to see your interest and your support. Well, the UCC Jean Monnet lecture series now finishes for this academic year. All of the recordings are available on the Department of Government and Politics website, and this recording will go up tomorrow at some point. There's a link in the chat to the webpage. And there's also a link in the chat to a new free online CPD course, which we're running here at UCC on understanding EU challenges and crises. Again, the link is in the chat. And please feel free to share that information with colleagues and friends and family. I suppose it's our own very modest attempt at confronting some of the disinformation in relation to the EU. So thank you to all our speakers, all of our audience for your support and your interest. I hope you'll come back and join us in September. I'm hoping that some of our events will be in person, but we will be trying to keep a hybrid approach in terms of involving an online audience as well. So if we can't welcome you to Cork, I hope we can welcome you to a screen instead. You can watch my Twitter account at Mary C. Murphy and my own Department of Government and Politics website for all of the updates. But until then, thank you once again. And until next time, I hope everyone has a lovely evening. All the best.
Thank you very much for having me.